back. Alcohol and nicotine today, an order of consumption that is likely familiar to some of you. In response to this student comment, wondering whether marijuana is getting more popular than alcohol in Canada, there's very little chance of marijuana passing alcohol in use. If we go by Statistics Canada, we can say that there were as many Canadians who binge drank every month last year than there were who had one joint or more over the entire year. Now, as the World Health Organization warned us, cannabis use in young people is obscenely high in Canada, and use by both genders is climbing, but comparing apples to apples, we can collapse across categories and say roughly 25% of Canadians use cannabis at least once a year, but for alcohol that number is 80%. Around 1 out of 4 Canadians use weed once or more per year, and 4 out of 5 Canadians use alcohol once or more per year. We use alcohol more of us have tried it, at around 90% of Canadians having tried alcohol in their lifetime, and we approve of alcohol more, with around 90% of us saying occasional use is acceptable. Availability bias and the news cycle might have us believe that cannabis is more popular and opioids are more deadly, but alcohol is much more popular than marijuana and kills far more Canadians than opioids.
Alcohol is killing more people than opioid drugs, but we're not blaming the alcohol for it.
That said, hopefully you have had time to put some thought into answering the homework question: why does depriving male fruit flies of mating make them abuse alcohol? Often, answers will naturally include some version of a drive theory, the idea that there's some sort of drive or inherent inborn motivation to modify our consciousness, or a more specific drive to experience pleasure. And if we cannot satisfy this drive in one place, we satisfy it in another. This appears to plug in well with the cellular level of analysis, where we see a general mechanism, dopamine, being implicated in a diverse range of behaviors and being tied to all addictions. But I have cautioned us before about thinking we explained or understood something when in fact we've just described it at another level. I don't want people new to the biological level of analysis to think that it holds the answers when it just gives us another level of description of the situation or processes of addiction. What satisfies us for explanation of fruit fly behavior might not satisfy for general mammal, ape, or human behavior, even where the explanation is just as accurate or true across all of them. So, there are two cautions that I would like to install here regarding the appeal to drives or to chemical explanations. The first is a Skinnerian one. Don't jump to invisibles. Pharmacotherapy on its own is powerful and can be necessary, but let's assume we have a case where more is needed than just a prescription. Let's be as harsh as we can about what the biological level of understanding actually contributes for our client. Being able to name a bunch of ligands that are acting in a client's brain and what they are doing or what they quote-unquote want is about as useful as telling a morality fairy story about good and bad characters fighting for control of the client. To be clear, this is actually often useful, but all the work of understanding and motivating change here is actually being done by the morals that we're giving to those stories and characters. Whether our explanation involves pleasure drives or dopamine spikes, biological level insights are 1 or 2 dimensions shy of what human clients actually need. We need a behavioral analysis that informs and monitors behavioral change. With biological explanations,
you think you have a cause when in fact you're just reasoning circularly or inventing unfalsifiable constructs. Pragmatically, Skinner was saying, don't jump to invisibles, don't jump to these things that fill in gaps in our knowledge until we've done a good job of shrinking those gaps as much as we can with actual observation. In his words, I don't think inferred concepts adequately make up for things lacking in a behavioral analysis. We need a complete account at the external level. Skinner would occasionally point to psychophysicists and psychophysiologists and say, I don't think you're doing what you seem to think you're doing. To say that a given action in the brain corresponds to a given behavior is not really to understand how that behavior comes about. Whatever the mechanism in the black box happens to be, it is still a response to environmental cues and environmental stimuli. So Skinner wanted to simply move from what we can see, what we can observe in the environment, and what our behaviors are, without being distracted by the muscle mechanism of that behavior. All the lighting up and firing that the brain is doing is, to the good determinist, just a response to environmental stimuli, and if you measure the environmental stimuli and you measure the output, then you're going to have probably the clearest picture you can. The more you focus on these processes, this lighting up, these neurons firing, the more distracted away you are from a proper analysis. That can lead to the prediction, comprehension, and control of behavior. An in-class demonstration I like to do is illustrated here. I get one person to dance or move their body in a given way. I have someone else standing opposite them who is trying to copy them as faithfully as they can. And then I have a third person who is in front of person one, so they can't see person one, and they are copying person two. So what gets done by person one, who represents the environment or stimuli, eventually gets copied in a rudimentary fashion by person three, and we can observe the connection between person 1 and person 3, even when person 2 is hidden. Now what person 2 is doing is mediating the relationship between person 1's actions and person 3's actions. If we imagine that person 2 is invisible, we can still infer a lot about the relationship between person 1 and person 3, without guessing about what person 2 must be doing. Person 2 is mediating the relationship between person 1 and person 3, and if our goal is to predict 3 from 1, there's a fair chance that we're wasting our time by focusing on 2, the thing that has the most unknowns, the invisible component of this mediating relationship. This does not mean that 2 is not important. It does not mean that 2 does not exist. It's an acknowledgement that to the extent that 2 is important, we would be able to see it manifested in what 3 does relative to what 1 is doing. A good example of this philosophy in action is when Chomsky wrote a very long piece of work criticizing Skinner's attempts in his book Verbal Behavior to explain how children take stimulation input from their environment, words, corrections that their parents give and say, and turn it into their own speech. The idea being that they approximate how their parents talk, and they learn through corrections and the reward that comes with success how to do something as complex as speak. Chomsky pointed out that language and the new constructions that even very small kids give us are way too complex, way too novel to have been simply copied or learned through trial and error. My 2.5-year-old this morning said I had an orange Pebbles vitamin from the pink vitamin container, and he was rewarded with the fact that I understood him and we were able to continue having a conversation about it. But Chomsky's argument is that by Skinner's theory, a child shouldn't be able to make such a new novel construction without having been rewarded for that same or a nearly identical construction previously. So Skinner's theory is not a satisfying explanation of how my son came to construct such a difficult sentence. Chomsky's contribution to the discussion was we have this built-in biological language acquisition device which can pick up on patterns, and we seem to have a universal pattern recognition ability that corresponds to the universal grammar that seems to underlie every language that we construct. And this is what, in the mediating system, which is the child's mind, helps the child to translate all of this learning into novel constructions themselves. Chomsky says without this language acquisition device, the Skinnerian theory is impoverished and it can't actually explain novelty and the picking up on rules. And Skinner didn't even bother to respond because Chomsky is just basically violating his first rule, which is going into the mediating relationship, going into the person 2, and saying these are the qualities that person 2 must have in order to map the relation faithfully from person 1 to person 3. For Skinner, that's just not the point. The Skinnerian analysis looks at what happens in the child's environment or the children's environment and what do the children produce in response to this environment. It doesn't care about the minutiae and mechanics of how. And the Skinnerian approach is what we use now, albeit in different fields, to understand how language acquisition is accomplished and optimized. The best thing you can do for your child, unsurprisingly, is to be hyperverbal, to explain lots of things, especially things that are meaningful to the child or things that you show the child are meaningful. This produces the largest vocabulary, which is the most common way we measure the person 3, the output in this situation, but also more comprehension and ability to follow when somebody presents you with something novel in language. The mediating concept that we should do away with, that I would probably be most able to convince you we need to do away with, is motivation. Now, motivation exists, but when we use it as a tool to theorize and understand ourselves, it's usually in our way of actually understanding ourselves. Let's say you have a goal, you have something that you want to accomplish, and you try and fail. A good Skinnerian analysis and applied behavioral analysis would say, okay, what things in your environment caused you to fail? What things, at the very least, weren't sufficient to reward you enough to continue the behavior that you were trying to sustain? A better way of putting this, how were you rewarded for not accomplishing your goal? A question that usually gets funneled into the question of how did you procrastinate? Instead of asking these person 1 types of things, we go to person 2 and we say, well, what invisible things inside my head weren't quite right in order to get my person 3 to behave in the way I wanted? I probably wasn't motivated. Which might be true, but if you stop there, well, then that's useless. And most of us do stop there. Oh, I didn't accomplish my goal, not because I didn't change my environment enough, but because I just wasn't desiring enough of success. So the next time we try to accomplish our goal, we say, okay, this time I really want it. This time I'm actually motivated. We rewrite history and pretend that we were motivated the original time that we failed. Our looking into the invisible black box, the person 2, the mediating relationship, prevented us from looking at person 1, the actual environmental contingencies that we could have changed to change our quote-unquote motivation to change the outcome that we actually produced. Motivation is only a useful concept to the extent that it gets you to look at person 1, the environment, the stimuli, that you could change in order to change that motivation, i.e. to produce the desired person 3 behavior. The red flag for Skinner is when you posit these concepts like motivation and then you don't refer them back to anything on the person 1, the environmental stimuli level. If you're not specifying any action, you are probably distracting yourself from an actual understanding of what's happening. If you're talking about things that other people can see and things that we can somehow manipulate, like the number of bags of chips in your apartment, or the distance between you and your phone that has Candy Crush on it, when you're mapping onto these manipulable, demonstrable conditions, then you are doing effective theorizing and work. A less abstract example that gets to this point is food is not important because of a hunger drive. Food is not valuable to us because of an instinct. It's valuable to us because if we don't eat it, we'll die. So we do not need some imagined internal state, says Skinner. Too long didn't listen. Some concepts explaining behavior actually keep us from understanding it. Desire, free will. He famously wrote a book called Beyond Freedom and Dignity. The idea was that those concepts might lead us to stop at the concept and not move to the actual environmental conditions that create freedom or that create dignity for people. Skinner rejected these concepts and rejected speculation beyond what was measurable as a rate or as a probability. This is not a denial of soul, spirit, freedom, dignity, motivation. It's an understanding that what we want from those things as outcomes would be better brought about by the analysis of manipulable, demonstrable conditions that the concept, defining it and describing it, distracts us from. In other words, we think and pursue knowledge more productively without these presumptive concepts. With Skinner, the emphasis is on, well, if I can understand and measure person 1, the environment, well enough, then I should be able to predict the outputs, the person 3, the behaviors, the things that we want to see produced by the individual, prospectively. And I can even have a vague idea of my error rate. I can know how predictable someone is. I can know how useful the explanation or knowledge of the environment is to predicting the output, the behavior that somebody engages in. What can I change in my environment to shape my behavior? And how often would I expect this change to be successful in shaping my behavior? So Skinner gave us all kinds of things that are practically useful.
The second caution I want you to have when appealing to drives or chemical explanations is to watch out for loops in your reasoning, explaining, or understanding. Don't loop yourself. A sizable part of the psychological research into alcohol abuse looks at denial. And since I've covered defense mechanism styles elsewhere, and have other plans for how to expand on those, I want to approach the challenge of denial and motivated reasoning from a wholly different angle here. I want to get you in the habit of looking for loops. Noticing a loop can change your life. The first time I recall noticing a loop was at Bible camp. The argument from the serious grown-ups in the room to us tweens was, the Bible is true because it is the Word of God, and the Word of God is true because the Bible says so. The only relevant analogy I could conjure to understand at the time was the chicken and egg problem. I said something along the lines of, so the chicken and the egg both came first? And the grown-up response was to get offended, rather than to shepherd me to some sort of understanding. Any toddler of intelligence could potentially recognize this formulation in the exhausted parent saying, because I said so, which, for the first time you say it, might refer to this. What I say is true. I say bedtime is 8 o'clock, therefore bedtime is 8 o'clock. But the second time you say, because I said so, it would refer to something like this. What I say is true. I say what I say is true, therefore what I say is true. So we have now entered one of the many dreaded loops of parenting. Any clever, exhausted parent right now might get an idea from this, and they wouldn't be the first. The idea of grabbing a random book, opening it to a random page and saying, it says here that mommy is right, that 8 o'clock is when you have to go to bed. What's that book, mommy? Well, this book is the true book of the most true things ever. Any questioning of mommy can now be deferred to the book's authority, and any questioning of the book can now be deferred to mommy's authority. For good measure, add in a cooperative daddy and another random book, And you've got the appearance and therefore the apparent moral force of 3 whole reasons to listen to Mommy. If this random book deception seems to you to be an epistemically terrible thing to do to a child, then we're on the same page. But if you dare, I advise you to take this thinking tool. Let's call it source looping, since it's just finding something that will point us to where we are already at conclusion-wise. Take this idea of source looping and start noticing how often this exact trick is used to bewilder, delay, and deceive us in the real world. Well-meaning and ill-meaning people alike are perpetuating source loops. Random book deceptions are the weak but legitimate-seeming shields behind which unearned power and questionable moral authority hide from the gaze of thoughtful people. More to the point of this course, though, I want you to check your personal theory of addiction as it develops and the reasoning you encounter from yourself and others about addiction using the source looping thinking tool. Patent pending. To use the thinking tool, ask yourself whether a given statement, reason, or part of your model is just there to justify or distract from something weak or indefensible. Just a random book yanked down for convenience. Examples that are rather low-hanging fruit include, you hear the following: relapsing for a 3rd time means I will never quit successfully. This is the 3rd time that I've relapsed, so I can never quit. I will never successfully quit. This is logically valid if you accept the universal premise. But why would you? Instead, it should set off your source loop detector. Where did the 3rd time rule come from? What random book says the nth failure means success is impossible, and why should we believe that? Another. If someone believes a substance to be harmless because it is legal, this is a valid inference. It would read, legal psychoactive substances are fine, marijuana is legal, therefore marijuana is fine. But it also sounds like a source loop. Marijuana may, by some standards, be fine, and I don't know what your standards are, and I respect your freedom to set them for yourself. But standards for reasoning belong to everyone, and it seems like this universal affirmative, legal psychoactive substances are fine, was grabbed in a vain attempt to find anything that pointed to marijuana is fine. Notice that this source looping thinking tool is intended to contain or bring together quite a few others that are more specialized. Motivated reasoning, circular reasoning, denial, confirmation bias, self-fulfilling prophecy, what you see is all there is, question begging, appeal to authority, appeal to ignorance, question swapping, infinite regress, availability bias, burden of proof, and a host of other logical fallacies and defense mechanisms. Looking for source looping is looking for circular rationalizing, reasoning that only serves to justify a conclusion. When pushed or questioned, the reasoning circles around and references itself. The reasoning is a shield from scrutiny or weeds to hide in until the topic changes. My aim for the tool is to help you more easily parse statements like, since I'm still good at my job, I must not have an addiction. Okay, where is it written that job success precludes addiction? Since I can come up with other people whose behavior is worse than mine, my behavior must be fine. What is the point here of saying all cases except the worst case is fine? Since this behavior is normal for us, or them, or me, it must not be harmful to us, or them, or me. Says who? If you prick us, do we not bleed? Studies that find IQ and other cognitive decline with marijuana use must be biased, because I know an engineer who is smart and smokes weed. Have you thought about the possible weaknesses of that argument? Since I was able to stop before, taking up the behavior again is fine. I'll just quit again later. Well, why did you quit before? Since there are many different interpretations or judgments of my behavior, there must be no correct or best one to make. Is that the best or most correct thing for you to believe? Since I am unlike the average user in some ways, I must not have the average user's risks or problems. All snowflakes are special, but all snowflakes melt. Since I do not feel that I have a problem, I must not have a problem. All drunk drivers think that they can drive. Since I am aware of my problem, I must have control over it. Okay, so what's this problem that you are aware of?
I look at you, I don't see an intelligent, confident man. I see a cocky, scared, shitless kid. I can't learn anything from you. I can't read in some fucking book. Unless you want to talk about you, who you are. But you don't want to do that, do you, sport? You're terrified of what you might say. Your move, Chief.
Only about half of Canadians have tried tobacco at some point in their lives. Alcohol is 4.5 times more popular than tobacco as a substance of regular use. This is despite both of them being legal. Yet, despite this huge difference in use, the number of Canadians addicted to tobacco, going by the DSM-4 criteria for dependence, is about the same as the number addicted to alcohol. Nicotine is just much more addictive than alcohol, in part because it has a faster onset of psychotropic effects. It takes around 10 seconds for the nicotine in a smoked cigarette to reach the brain, but 20 to 30 minutes for alcohol to take effect. To be sure, placebo effects kick in far quicker than that, and most of us are likely familiar with seeing someone appear to get drunk the instant they swallow the alcohol, but the body needs to absorb, transmit, and process substances before they take effect. Perhaps because it is so much more addictive, tobacco, despite its much lower use, is more deadly and medically expensive to Canadians than alcohol. In 2014, tobacco was listed as the cause of 145,801 hospitalizations in Canada, while alcohol was listed as the cause of 87,911. The current Health Canada guidelines are to stay the hell away from tobacco and only have 1 drink a day if you must drink alcohol. But in speaking to a university class, one is mostly preaching to the choir. Rates of tobacco use in university-educated samples tend to be about 1/3 of those of the greater population. And in all corners of Canada, we can expect to see tobacco use rates continue to gradually get lower and lower, mostly due to an increase in young people who have never even tried tobacco, and so never got the chance to get addicted. Canada recently passed a milestone where there are now more former smokers than current smokers in the country. This means we can expect, as the years go on, fewer cases of these and other problems. Tobacco, despite fewer than half of the population having tried it, and only around 15% of Canadians regularly using it, is the number one behavior. That is, smoking is the number one behavior that causes death and disease, especially cardiovascular disease. Now, if you count physical inactivity as a behavior, then tobacco is the second leading behavioral cause of ill health. Physical inactivity would then be number one, but I think it takes a bit of arguing/imagination to establish inactivity as a behavior. Much like only 15% of the Canadian population smokes regularly, only 15% of the Canadian population actually gets the minimum required amount of exercise suggested by Health Canada. This graph is here for the people who like to vape or smoke e-cigs and say things like they haven't been linked to any of the health problems that smoking is linked to. Disease processes and epidemiological studies both take time. If something new has not yet been established as harmful, that just means it's not an instant kill. Here is the US Surgeon General in 1956. Much greater knowledge is needed before any conclusions can be drawn concerning relationships between smoking and increased death rates from coronary heart disease. And here they are, 4 years later, in 1960. Conclusions have been reached which clearly relate increased cigarette smoking to an increase in death rates from coronary heart disease. And note what happens to the graph of coronary heart disease deaths after they mention this. The reduction in deaths follows quite nicely from the reduction in use. Back in the 50s, half of North Americans smoked. That number has been going down steadily since the Surgeon General's reports in the 1960s. Since you already know the harms of tobacco, here are a few summary numbers to put a finer point on that knowledge you already have. 9 years. On average, regular cigarette smoking reduces life expectancy by about 9 years. 17%. In 2002, smoking accounted for 17% of the total deaths that year in Canada. Smoking accounted for 20% of male deaths and 12% of female deaths in that year. 23 times. Men who smoke are 23.3 times more likely to die of lung cancer than men who have never smoked. To emphasize that, the second leading cause of lung cancer is something most of us have never heard of. It's radon gas poisoning, which, depending on where you live, may or may not be a problem for you. $17 billion. In 2002 alone, tobacco use cost Canadian taxpayers $17 billion. That year alone in healthcare, social services, and lost productivity. Think of all the things we could do with $17 billion, and know that cost is not offset by the fact that federal and provincial governments make money from absurdly high tobacco taxes. Yearly tobacco sale revenues overall can be estimated at around $7.5 billion, and $17 billion minus $7.5 billion is a $9.5 billion loss to the Canadian taxpayers. And keep in mind that the $7.5 billion we quote-unquote made that we got to subtract from the $17 billion came with a cost of death, disease, and potential years of life lost of tens of thousands of our fellow citizens. Next, 7 to 8 years. Quitting smoking before the age of 35 adds an average of 7 to 8 years to one's life expectancy. Next, top 4. Tobacco use, especially smoking cigarettes, is a major direct contributor to all 4 of the top causes of death in North America. Finally, 1.6 million. Let's work our way up to this number. Cancer is the leading cause of death in Canada. 1 in 4 of us will die from it. This is in part because we live long enough to die from it. We get to live long enough to be killed by our own cellular replication errors. We are fortunate enough to not have to worry much about dying from the things our great-grandparents tended to, like infection. Shown here in the bar chart are your chances of surviving 5 or more years after diagnosis of different types of cancer. Survival rates are best for thyroid cancer at the top and worst for pancreatic cancer at the bottom. The lung cancer survival rate is one of the lowest, but this is far and away the most preventable cancer. And it is not just lung cancer that tobacco causes. It is a leading or the leading cause of most of the cancers that have the worst 5-year survival rates. This brings us back to the 1.6 million. That is the number of individuals worldwide who died from lung cancer alone, just lung cancer, in 2012. A disease like chronic obstructive pulmonary disorder where most cases are attributable to tobacco. There will be more coverage of alcohol and tobacco in the intervention videos, but that's enough for now. Your homework is to reflect on these facts about tobacco use and risk, and your responses to them. Do these facts make you feel good about not smoking? Do they make you feel better about your drinking, because at least it's not smoking, or your vaping, or your weed smoking? Does the lecture make you think that cigarettes should be illegal, or other substances should be legal? And are those wise feelings or thoughts to have? This lecture arms you with plenty of random facts, readily available for source looping. Are you up to the challenge of using these facts wisely? Cannabis Next, by popular demand. Stay tuned.
Have you had any experience with that?
20 years of counseling. Yeah, I've seen some pretty awful shit.
I mean, have you had any experience with that?
Personally.
Yeah.
Yeah, I have.
Sure ain't good.
My father was an alcoholic. Mean fucking drunk. He'd come home hammered, looking to wail on somebody. So I'd provoke him so he wouldn't go after my mother and little brother. Interesting nights were when he wore his rings.
Yeah, he used to just put a wrench, a stick, and a belt on the table and just say choose.
Well, I gotta go with the belt there, Vanna.
I used to go with the wrench.
Why the wrench?
Because fuck him, that's why.
Your foster father.
Yeah. So, you know, what is it, like, Will has an attachment disorder? Is it all that stuff? Fear of abandonment? Is that why I broke up with Skylar?
I didn't know you had.
I did.
You wanna talk about it?
No.
Hey, Will. I don't know a lot. You see this? All this shit. This is not your fault. Look at me, son. It's not your fault.
I know.
It's not your fault.
I know.
No, you don't. It's not your fault.
I know.
It's not your fault.
All right.
It's not your fault. It's not your fault. Don't fuck with me. It's not your fault.
Don't fuck with me, all right? Don't fuck with me, Sean, not you.
It's not your fault. It's not your fault.
Oh my God. Oh my God, I'm so sorry.
Fuck that.